Welcome to the Innovative Pedagogy Podcast, where we inquire with the greatest minds in academia, where innovation, creativity, and authenticity meet the best teaching and learning practices for educators all over the world. Most importantly, hoping all those we come in touch with leave inspired and ready to change their world. Here's our host, Chris Garcia.
Welcome to the Innovative Pedagogy Podcast, everyone. I am your host, Chris Garcia, and today we have part 2 from our last episode. Are teachers really teaching critical race theory? However, rather than just hearing from my perspective, today I have the honor of interviewing one of my graduate classmates from the University of San Diego, and now he's a history teacher of 10 years, currently working with the Redondo Beach Unified School District, Mr. Peter Rappaport. Peter, welcome to the show. Great to connect with you and to see you, dude.
Yeah, Chris, thanks so much for having me. When you filmed that first podcast, I listened to it, and we've always had our side conversation. So I'm really excited to be here and share my own thoughts on the subject matter.
No, absolutely. And I've always leaned to you, especially when it comes to like U.S. history. And I remember reaching out to you maybe a few months ago, just when it comes to just kind of like the resources of like, all right, 1918, we kind of experienced this whole pandemic again. Unfortunately, there's not that many people alive from that time that were, it's almost 100 years. So, but just to kind of see like, how did they leave that pandemic and whatnot? And I love learning from history. I mean, that's why partly I became a teacher, but I'm a multiple subject. So I teach everything. You have a single subject and you have that history focus in that. So definitely appreciate that. And then also just want to make it known out there that we do connect well. The Padres are my favorite team, but because I played for the Boston Red Sox as my first Little League team, I've always had an appreciation for them since the days of Mo Vaughn and Peter himself. You're from Boston, right?
I am. And I remember you used to wear your Red Sox hat in grad school, and I was like, oh, I like this guy.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the reason why. So if I had to choose an AL team, I will always be a Red Sox fan. Especially when they were playing the Astros and the the Dodgers. I was like, go Red Sox for sure.
Yeah, I think everybody roots against the Astros these days.
Yeah, that is true too. That is true. So well, let's go ahead and dive into it. First off, let's kind of take it back to 10 years ago. Why did you want to become a history teacher? This is one of those things where I always find it's a very interesting subject to teach because there's various ways of going about it. And I mean, I don't know, like, why did you want to become a history teacher 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I actually didn't really know that I wanted to be a history teacher until I was getting my degree to become a teacher. Teaching was something that my mom did for a long time. She did it for 35 years. So I was always around the education system. And really, when I looked back and made my decision to go back to school to become a teacher, I thought about what was like the subject matters that made sense to me the most. And I was terrible at math. I was okay at science, but history was the one subject that always kind of made sense to me. And I would say social sciences as a whole. I took a lot of psychology and sociology classes in addition to like gen ed history classes. And, I remember my assignments when I was in school. It was rote memorization. It was read the book and answer the questions. And as I got older and started traveling the world, and in college, I had downtime where I could watch the History Channel. There was so much that was never taught to me that I decided if I was going to go back to school to be a history teacher, I wanted to be that teacher who talked about things in a way that they weren't taught to me. Because as you travel the world and meet people from different parts of the country, you learn that, everybody kind of has a different understanding. And I wanted to bring that to life in the classroom setting where we can talk about these different perspectives to hopefully create more understanding on everybody's part.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And it's interesting to see how when you leave the United States and you get a chance to visit another country, there's at times you see people that appreciate you, and you also see people that are like, get away from me.
Absolutely.
I don't want to talk to you. Like, you little American scumbag. I'm like, whoa, what did I do? I didn't do anything. But it's just where we come from, what we represent. and it opens up opportunities for conversations, and that's really cool. I really appreciate that, and it's interesting that you go with that mentality because, and we'll allude to this, of course, as we move forward, but that kind of leads us to where we're at now. And but I want to go back to just kind of teaching pedagogy, and when it comes to teaching history, what are your main objectives? Like you mentioned earlier, like you were taught by learning facts, memorization. Like, is it about learning historical figures? Is it maybe talking about the mistakes that historical figures made? So when you teach history, when you're looking at like your pacing guide, when you're looking at your scope and sequence, like what is your main objective when it comes to teaching history?
I think a lot of different ways I could go with this question, but I think the way I look at teaching history is I look at my role is to use history as a vehicle to teach my students skills that are going to help them well beyond the classroom.
Okay.
So at the center of my class is definitely critical thinking, but we focus a lot on like failure and mistakes, and we use history as a lesson to teach that. But also, I run a student-centered classroom. I'm not the teacher who's lecturing at the kids every day. A lot of it is providing them with the background knowledge and then creating conversations, whether that's in small group or whole class, where they really get to talk about their understanding of the events.
Yeah.
Because, they're the future leaders of our society. And my goal is to have them walk out of this class so that in 10 years, if they're talking about, I don't know, the importance of the Constitution, that they can have a conversation with somebody about why, the Bill of Rights is so important. And I want them to understand it in a modern context. Yeah, they can talk. It's great to know like what the intentions were back in the 1700s, but you never want to be that person who's in a conversation that feels lost. Yeah. You always want to be able to kind of, at least if you don't know everything, be able to ask questions that then allow you to understand. And I kind of use history as a way to do that. I always reference back, and this is, more our generation, but there's a Friends episode where Joey buys the letter V encyclopedia from Penn and Teller, and he starts using all these V words. And Joey's that character in the show who every time they're talking about something, he laughs because they do, but doesn't understand. And so I always show them that clip and say, you don't want to be that. You want to be the person who can be a part of the conversation.
Right.
That's my main objective, is to get my students to be critical thinkers, to be questioners, to really be able to engage in dialogue with their peers and with adults.
Yeah. What about the phrase, and this is kind of, off script because I'm not going to go straight to the questions, but like the idea of like history repeating itself.
Yeah.
That's something that you, is that like an essential question that you can possibly ask your students? Is like, all right, how is history repeating itself this time, everyone? Like, do you ever use that phrase at all, or something alluded to that?
I don't use that exact phrase, but we, my team and I here developed a set of year-long questions that we kind of approach throughout the year. And one of our focus questions is how do actions of the past help shape modern society, which kind of gets to that idea. And we also have, how do we determine truth in history? And does history always reflect progress? And if so, for who? So we tackle that subject matter for sure on a daily basis in our classroom. And, I teach 8th grade. So that's, colonial life through Reconstruction era. So we try to find those opportunities as much as possible to get kids to understand the so what about what we're talking about. And the best way we can do that is connecting it to things that they see happening right now in front of them, and kind of doing a backwards approach to history. So we were in our unit a couple weeks ago on the women's rights movement during the 1800s. And it just so happened that the leaked decision about the Roe v. Wade stuff came out. And so we started talking about the interconnectivity of the women's rights movement in the 1800s and early 1900s to what they are still fighting for today. And I think that's really where you start to see the kids be like, okay, I now understand why I need to know what happened 200, 300 years ago, because it's not an isolated event. There's a history of this stuff happening. And that's what I want to be able to do with them is I tell them, I don't care, if you walk out of here and you're like, I forgot most of what Mr. Rappaport taught me, but I remembered how to ask questions and how to think for myself and how to argue with somebody else in a Socratic way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then I've done my job.
Yeah.
Because those are the skills that are going to translate to all different avenues of education and life.
Yeah. No, that's really important. Even as you're saying the whole, like, I just love the whole idea of the Socratic seminars, being able to, it's funny because I remember I participated in my first one in college. And even during that time, it wasn't until college that I actually learned about like the truth of Christopher Columbus.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that he did. And I alluded also to this about like Hernan Cortez in my last episode, and I know you heard that part, but it's interesting to see that. It's all good. I can edit that part.
Okay.
It's interesting to see that when I look back at these situations, it's like at times it can be shocking, but at the same time, you want to know the truth behind history, like you mentioned. You want to know the why behind it. And but the point I want to make right now is this whole idea of having these meaningful conversations. And there's a phrase that I kind of feel like we haven't heard in this day and age, and regardless of where people stand, but it's that whole idea of like, you know what? At the end of the day, let's also agree to disagree, and then maybe we could come back to this later on. So I don't know. What are your takes on that? Do you ever have those debates in class where you have to kind of be the mediator? Even though I know as teachers, we have our beliefs, we have our core beliefs and everything, but do you ever find yourself having to be the mediator between students who are like, you know what? Let's go ahead and just agree to disagree right now.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, I think, especially when you touch on sensitive matters that, I work with middle school kids. So for the most part, and this isn't all of them, but for the most part, their opinions are heavily informed by their parents. And we know that as educators, that what kids are saying in our class, they may not fully understand the scope of what they're saying, or they may be just repeating what they heard on the news. So I think, I create an idea that everybody's voice deserves to be heard in my class. But when there are those scenarios where somebody's clearly offended, I'll step in and try to mediate, and I'll ask clarifying questions to better understand what's being said. Because sometimes, our students aren't always the best at vocalizing exactly what they mean to say.
Yeah.
But I like those moments, and I know some teachers shy away from them, but those are the moments where a lot of learning happens for the students, for you as a teacher, because those are the same types of conversations that we have as adults in society that, quite frankly, technology and other matters have really taken away. Like, I remember if I had a disagreement with somebody, it was always face to face, because we didn't grow up in the email and social media era. And so, you're going to have to learn how to work with and be in the same room as people who have different opinions. And so rather than like mediating and diverting, I try to mediate and create like that sense of, you believe what you believe and they believe what they believe. You're not here to convince each other one way or the other. You're here to listen. And of course, there are things, if they're said, that you have to step in and stop. But for the most part, it's usually things that get cleared up. And the kids, they have short-term memories. They usually move on from those things. It doesn't create and that's part of like the culture I've created in my classroom. And it's taken me a long time to get there, but it's this idea of allowing kids to feel comfortable. And I think that that's what, as a history teacher, because we talk about a lot of sensitive subjects, it creates an understanding in here that at the end of the day, you and I might disagree, but that doesn't mean I have the right to call you stupid or, go out on social media and trash you for it. There's a respect that needs to be created and a culture that needs to be created that allows the kids to speak freely and understand when they've crossed the line. Yeah.
As you're saying that, it's just, I feel like as teachers, we have that opportunity to even model that. I'm active on Twitter, on a lot of different things. And there was a situation that actually happened about 5 years ago in my classroom, and someone was actually cyberbullying me. And and thankfully it wasn't to the point where They had profanities on there where I couldn't share with my students. But I asked my students, I'm like, hey, look at this person actually disagrees with me. And they're actually now trying to humiliate me online. Like, what do I do? And then I kind of presented a situation where I was like, all right, do you want me to talk back to them? So I said, and be honest with me. Like, if you think I should retaliate, how would I do it? What would your suggestions be? So it opened up a good hour discussion of like, what is Mr. Garcia going to do on social media? At the end of the day, they all decided like, you know what? Just ignore it and just block that person and just leave it alone and move forward. I'm like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And I wanted just to prove to them like, hey, there are times at social media now that these platforms that for you, it's just normal to like be born and already have a social media account, you know? So at that idea is like, all right, let me go ahead and guide you and model to you. And I feel like as teachers, we need to be at times transparent with our digital footprint and how we even respond to this, because sometimes the modeling they may get, whether it be at home or at wherever their organizations or nonprofits or whatever they're a part of, they might see these things going back and forth. I'm like, oh, then if I see political leaders and religious leaders and any other leaders out there, activists going back and forth, then it's okay for me to do it. And I'm like, wait a second, that's not exact. It's like what you just said. It's not the way we were raised. As far as if you have an issue with someone, you go face to face and you handle it. And you handle it, but not in a bad way, but in a way where it's like, it's respectful, there's mediation, and you can still walk away with like, all right, you said what you said, I said what I said, we're going to be cool. We know not to cross this boundary anymore either, because it'll trigger one of us. So did you want to add more to that? Yeah.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that's part of the issue is like, you know, kids, our students grew up with social media. Like they're native to it.
Yeah.
But like we were learning at the same time they were, yet we forgot all like how to behave on social media, because you do, like, to your point, you see these adults bickering back and forth. And I think you can engage, right? Like they decided for you, just block that person. That's one avenue. And I think there's a way to engage with those people that at least from your end can be done the right way. You know, my first thing, I remember, obviously, my students all get to know me pretty well. They see the posters in my classroom. You know, I have James Baldwin, I have Audre Lorde, I have Harvey Milk. So they understand, okay, they can read what kind of person I am and probably where I fall, but I never express my opinions verbally because that's not my job.
Right.
But what I do think is that, like, when you have a parent or a student or somebody on social media come at you, especially as a teacher, because our job involves so much of like crisis aversion, is that you can kind of ask questions to make the same point that you might say something that doesn't come off as nice, and say, okay, show me your evidence, show me your proof. Like I treat it like I'm talking to a student, you know, I'm like, okay, so if that's your belief, how can you support this? Like, what are your sources? Where did you get this information from? And I think that's a way to engage in those situations. And they learn that through our history classes or anybody's class that uses critical thinking as like a driving force behind it.
Yeah. No.
And I think we need to do more of that. And adults, like you said, need to model more appropriate behavior.
Right. No, exactly. Especially us. I mean, we're, other than their parents, it's almost like we see these kids 5, 6, 7 hours, 5 days a week.
Yeah.
For 180 days, you know, a year. So like we have that influence. We definitely do as teachers. And but let's go ahead and kind of talk about with the focus even more of the title of this episode. But so when you heard the term critical race theory for the first time, first off, did you even know what it was? And second off, where did you hear it?
I had never heard the term used before, but I did. My younger sister is a psychology professor at Tennessee State, and she was really into intersectionality. Mm-hmm. So I had actually known about Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the CRT term, mm-hmm. through her. And but I did what anybody would have done. I went to the internet and I started to do my research on it, because I didn't want to be a teacher. I mean, I had a conversation at the beginning of the year with a parent who literally accused me of implementing CRT into my classroom. Luckily, I'd already done my homework on it, so I knew what I was talking about. But yeah, I went to the internet, and, you know, it's this idea that systemic racism is kind of ingrained in American society, whether it's our legal system, our political system, or the policies that we create that allow these social inequalities to continue to exist well after, multiple movements to try to create equality for all people in this world. So when I heard it, I was like, well, I'm a social studies teacher. I should probably educate myself so that if my kids want to talk about it or anybody else wants to talk about it, that I can say, listen, I'm not an expert on this. And my dad's an attorney, and I asked him, and he's like, yeah, I mean, we heard that term in law school, but it was a law school term. It wasn't something that was being taught in schools. And, the more I dug into it, as you see it in the media and as you see it in the news, you're like, this isn't what's being taught in schools.
Right.
And if it is, there are classes and content and where it makes sense to address those things.
Yeah.
But, I think, and I know this is, something else that we're going to talk about, but we've seen it. The media kind of jumped on this term and created it as anybody who's teaching the truth of what happened, which for some people is rewriting history, and for other people it's getting stories out there that have been otherwise silenced.
Right.
And I think when we talk about critical race theory, people assume that because you're teaching something that makes America not look like the greatest place in the world, that is critical race theory. That you are exploring, that you are asking hard questions. That's what they're deeming as critical race theory. But in actuality, we're just trying to give our students the full picture.
Yeah.
Because for us, we got our textbook and you read it and you were like, oh, that's what happened.
Yeah.
We were talking about this before the podcast. Like, your understanding of World War II from Japan's history textbooks, right?
Yeah.
It opens up your world and you're like, what else did I not know?
Yeah.
And I think that's how you get kids excited, is you don't just tell them the same narrative that we were all taught. You say, here's one story.
Yeah.
But we haven't heard from the other group who is affected by this.
Right.
That's being good teachers. That's not critical race theory.
And it's interesting because you mentioned right now your dad is an attorney. My wife is currently actually in law school right now. And one of the biggest things that we have all these conversations now because she's learning about all these different concepts and everything else. And it goes back down to anything else as far as there's always two sides of the coin.
Mm-hmm.
You have to know, there's a prosecutor and there's a defendant. You're going to have two different sides of the story and you have to hear it.
Yep.
If you're going to, even within our judicial system, innocent until proven guilty, you got to prove it.
Yep.
And we got to talk about the other sides of the coin. And the thing is, when I go back to World War II, yes, United States sent a message, and feel free to correct me also, because I respect you as a history teacher, but the United States sent a message pretty much to the rest of the world after we bombed Hiroshima. And then after that, it was all right, then the rest of the world's oh yeah, we don't want to be next. So we did that. And for the most part, World War II started to dissipate after that. But what happened to that? What happened to the civilians? What happened to the people in Japan? What happened to the people that were hiding in their bunker? The people that were exposed to this radiation that had never been exposed before amongst some mass human beings? What happened to their bodies? What happened to their cells? What happened to their mental health? What happened? All of that. Those things, I never learned it until I got to college. And I was like, man, and this whole time, even now, you'll watch Captain America 2 and you're like, yeah, Captain America 2 fighting this fictional story in World War II and stuff. Yeah, he took off the Red Skull and everything, but it's also and it's interesting because it's even the Wolverine, and forgive me because I even got the comic books, but the Wolverine kind of has that introduction where it's World War II and you start seeing people, and even that's his antagonist is someone that's actually Japanese, that was mutated, that survived this long period of time also, but that needs, so it's just kind of interesting to all right, let's just hear from both sides of the coin. And I don't know, how is that your approach when you look at a specific thing? Let's look at the whole picture. Is there if you can give me maybe a quick example of how would you teach a certain concept or a certain story in history like that?
Yeah. I try to ingrain as many primary source narratives about an event as I can.
Okay.
So, for example, when we do the Indian Removal Act, we obviously look at Jackson's speeches to Congress, but we also look at an American soldier's letter to his grandchildren, who everybody at the beginning is like, oh, he's going to be pro-Indian removal because he's an American. But it's actually, he grew up in the mountains with the native people of that area. And so for him, that experience was really painful. And then we read about it from a Native American perspective. And then we read it from a slave perspective, because what students often don't know is that in order to like assimilate into American culture, indigenous people would often own slaves to show white Americans that they were civilized, quote unquote, right? Because they didn't want to be seen as savages, which is how they're often described. So the way to do that is to mirror the behavior that they're seeing. So if we really want to understand the Indian Removal Act and the atrocities that happened during that time, we can't just read what happened from an American perspective, because it's going to say, oh, it helped begin westward expansion. It helped us, reach our goal of manifest destiny from sea to shining sea. But when all those stories go untold of everybody else who's involved, you're not just alienating those people's voices in history, but you're actually alienating kids within your own classroom. Because you're telling them that the only narrative that is important is the American white narrative. If that's all you study, and mostly that's what I was exposed to in high school, you don't learn, for going back to your World War II example, right? You don't learn what dropping that bomb on Hiroshima did to the civilians. Just because they happen to live in a country we are at war with, you don't see the long-term fallout.
Yeah.
And so as a history teacher, listen, everybody has their own comfort zone about what they're willing to do, but I'm here to do exactly that, lean into those hard conversations, because I start, just to give an example of like how we look at that, I do a privilege walk with my kids at the beginning of every year. I have parents who hate it, who think that I'm creating division, who don't understand that what it is about creating community and understanding that you and I do not come from the same walk of life. So the way that I approach history and see history might be different than you, but through a privilege walk, you can understand, because I'm back here and you're up here, why I might see that event that way. And so like, that's where my class starts every year. Is this is not to make somebody feel bad for being in the back of the front, but it's to understand that we all come with our own stories and our own lived experiences. And if we're going to get our students to be future, people of this society, they need to learn that not everybody grew up the way they grew up.
Right.
And then when I start to do that with history, the light bulbs start to click. They're like, oh, I know why this person views this event this way, because they've had this access to this opportunity. And I view it differently because maybe I grow up in a home with one parent who works 2 jobs just so I can live where I live. And so they're going to be more sympathetic towards a specific group than maybe the person who has both parents, grew up very affluent, has everything they need at their disposal, because they can't always put themselves in those shoes. And so I think when I'm doing my teaching and when I am planning, if I'm not having those conversations within every moment of history where we at least bring in one other voice, then I'm not doing my job.
That's really good, Pete. That's really, really cool. And the next question is this: is that what is some misconceptions that you think major media outlets, whether they be right wing or left wing, at this point it doesn't matter, let's just call them all out, but if they're right wing or left wing, but what are some misconceptions that they're saying about critical race theory? So when you watch the news or you hear news reports, and like, what goes through your mind when you hear that and you're like, wait, that's not right, that's not what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem that we have in our media is, I used to feel like there were places I could go where I could get a really balanced approach to a topic. And what I think, it's been going on for a long time, but I think because of the pandemic and everybody spent so much time at home the last couple of years, people had way more time to dig into the news that has become so hyper polarized
Yeah.
that I don't think anybody is truly in our like television media truly approaching this subject from a lens of here's what it is, and leaving, like, you know, if you're watching CNN, they're going to criticize the right for attacking like teachers trying to teach the truth, and if it's on the right, they're going to say liberals are utilizing CRT to teach kids to hate America and hate where they come from. Because what's happened is it's just become a battle of who can put the other one down. So I've stopped watching the news on a large scale because it's not a place I think to go to get true understanding anymore, because it's about viewership at this point, right? It's about gaslighting the other side because everybody is so right and left that to be down the middle, you're almost ostracized for that. If you have any more moderate views, they're like, no, you got to pick a side here. And I think the media has created that for us. And what it does, it further makes our job as educators really hard when we're trying to have conversations that are deemed critical race theory, but are actually just exposing people to new truths that our generations and generations before us never knew about.
Yeah.
So they see it as a threat because you're forcing adults who are 30, 40, 50, 60 plus years old to question everything they ever knew. And that's making them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But if we all thought in the same way that our people thought in the 1700s, what kind of world will we live in? Like, information is knowledge.
Right.
So for me to not give them that knowledge and pretend like it doesn't exist, then how can we expect to progress? And, you know, I don't think the media outlets care about progress. I think they care about division right now.
Yeah.
And how can they keep people tuning into them? And that's what creates this misinformation on both sides.
Yeah. No, and as you're saying that, it's just reminding me, it's reminding me of relatives that I have, and I love them all. But there are, it's also reminding me of people that I've worked with when I've worked with adults before. And you mentioned right now the age group of like 30, 40, 50. And I mean, I'm in the 30s, late 30s. So like and the advantage I have though, is that I love to learn. I love to question even what I do. Even being a sociology major, like I went in asking like, why are people the way they are? And I'm still intrigued by that question. I kind of mentioned that in the last podcast. Well, alluding to, I will say this, is that not everyone likes to learn. And there are some people that are stuck in their ways. And I will say this, is that when you try to teach them something, they get frustrated. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where it's not a one size fits all. The definition, Albert Einstein, I believe, and unless it's just an internet quote like Abraham Lincoln's, like I said this on the internet or with those fake quotes, but the definition of insanity is trying to do this. It's doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And I mean, talk to any engineer, they know like, no, I'm not going to go and try the same thing over again. I'm not having a PlayStation 1 and keeping it like that forever. We're now at PlayStation 5, it's like, we're going to continue to progress. So I feel that's the same thing that has to happen with this, within subjects, within core subjects, within things that happen. Everyone loves those Dateline specials. Like, oh, wow, we finally solved the mystery from 30 years ago. Yes. Tell me about it. Let me be intrigued by it. But that same that same approach of being intrigued by that needs to happen even with like, let's dive into Francis Scott Key a little bit more. Why did he write the Star Spangled Banner? What was his influence about it? I mean, why did he write it? Like, what was his intent? What kind of person was he? So it's just kind of going back, just having good questions and being able to go back to that. And that part, I definitely agree with. And I will say that one of the things that my wife actually brought up when it comes to news outlets was that she actually got to talk to several attorneys that work for news outlets. And they were talking they had a producer that come up from one of the local channels here in San Diego, Channel 10, ABC. And they were talking about how news is completely different. Social media just pretty much just tore up news. Yeah. People normally would wait for the local news to be like, all right, at 5 o'clock, we're going to talk about this. Even though something happened at 7 a.m. Mm-hmm. Even though something happened at 8 a.m., the news would be like, all right, we're going to go ahead and talk about this at 5. Give us time to research it, look at all sides and everything. But now because of social media, Now news reporters and journalists are forced to be like, oh, this happened 5 minutes ago. All right, get a report, write it out, talk about it right now. And it doesn't really give people an opportunity to look at all the facts, because it's more of like, I need to consume this immediately as it happens. So yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, we see it in the sports world, right? Like,
yeah,
these things are getting leaked out without the full story being there because we're in this like instant gratification world. Everybody wants to be the first one.
Yeah.
You want to be the one that gets retweeted. You don't want to be the one who's like following up on the initial breaking story.
Right.
And so like truth and fact finding and like true storytelling, it's kind of thrown to the side. It's like, hey, let me get this out there and then dig later. And if it's a big enough story, then we'll bring in other things, as opposed to developing a full story first and like doing it justice.
Yeah. And if there's anyone that understands that, is Padre fans, when they thought that Max Scherzer was going to be joining the Padres, and we knew it. And then like 6 hours later, now it's official. He's with the Dodgers. And I'm like,
right.
From that point on, I'm like, I'm not taking what anyone says on Twitter by facts for another 48 hours.
Yeah. And there's too much access to misinformation across a wide spectrum of things.
Yeah.
That you kind of have to, like, when you see those breaking news stories, whether they're political or sports or film or whatever, you have to be like, hold on, let me do my own digging and make sure that this is true.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of stuff out there that sounds real, and then you dig and you're like, oh, that was a fake story. They're just trying to get a reaction out of people.
Yeah.
So, and I think that that's part of what needs to shift, is like, we kind of have to go back to redefining what's important about what is getting put out there.
Yeah.
And like in journalism school and in the industry as a whole, maybe it's not about being the first to break the story. It's being the one to break the complete story.
There you go. That's good, man. And that kind of leads us, that's a nice segue into this last question. And that is that what's the difference between critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching?
Okay. So I think one is highlighting, so critical race theory is highlighting that systemic racism exists, and it expands across a variety of areas. And in addition to race, there's other layers of intersectionality that can add to that, like gender identity, socioeconomic status, religion. So like, if you're looking at a situation, understanding the role that racism plays within these institutions to allow these social inequalities to continue to exist, right? That's critical race theory. Culturally responsive teaching, in my opinion, takes on two things. One, it's understanding who your students in your classroom are, and then asking them, once you know that, asking them to find connections based on their own cultural backgrounds that they can relate to a story. So if we're talking about immigration in the 1800s, it's like the Irish, the Germans, they all came over, and then obviously you have people from China starting to come over to the West Coast. I asked my students, do any of you have an immigration story from your family that you know about? And when they can start I said, okay, so I have a student this year who came from Russia. And, I asked her, once we got to know each other, I said, what brought your family here? And she said, well, actually, my whole family didn't come, but I came for these reasons with my mom. And then you start to say, okay, so why were the Irish people coming, or the Germans, or Jewish people later on, or Chinese people coming over? And that's where you really start to implement culturally responsive teaching. It's where you're asking them to utilize their own lived experiences to connect to topics that they're discussing in class. And I think that's kind of where I think good teachers are doing it without even knowing.
Right. No, absolutely.
And if you ask most teachers, they're like, no, I don't do that. And I'm like, okay, so I also run a cooking class here that I started 5 years ago. And one of the things that we do is, the first question I ask them is, when you think of a food that reminds you of home, what is that dish?
Wow. Yeah.
And then we do a whole food culture project about what their relationship with food is. And it's really interesting because I have some students who are first generation American, and they talk about the role that food plays in their life. And then I have kids who, fifth generation American, and they're like, oh, I eat dinner with my brothers and my parents eat later. But then in other cultures, it's like, we have family dinner together every night. So, I think when you use culturally responsive teaching, you're tapping into things that kids can already understand in their own life and just connecting it to the content that you're showcasing to them.
Yeah. As you brought up right now, the point is teachers have been doing this without even knowing. And one of the stories that I shared with a friend of mine when we were having this discussion was the idea behind. I remember when I first started teaching, some of the second grade teachers went over a unit, and it was a Cinderella unit they were going to talk about. But they pulled the story of Cinderella from a variety of cultures, and they were going to have a cross-reference of it. But not only just cross-reference, like pick out similarities and everything, but they were going to talk about it. It was just what the things that really captivated me was taking the appreciations from each story and seeing how like the principles of each story are still applied in each culture, even though there's different props that they're using, different materials. It might not be a pumpkin, it might be an onion, it might be a zucchini that she's, that turned into the carriage or whatever, or different situations like that. And I was like, whoa, this is really cool. And it reminded me back in the day, I don't know if you ever saw this, but when Brandy and Whitney Houston did they did a Cinderella movie back in the late 90s.
Yes, I do remember that.
And I was like, wait a second, it sounds just like that. It was like, whoa. But again, it goes back to like these things have been happening when it comes to culturally responsive teaching, having students think outside the box, having students question. And I remember learning when I learned about going back to me being in college, I honestly felt like I was cheated not learning about who Christopher Columbus was.
Mm-hmm.
Because here I was celebrating someone that had ill intentions and did some really horrific things, like that would literally put people in jail right now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why didn't someone tell me? And like, let's look at the bigger picture. Like, yeah, the age of like exploration. Yeah, of course. Like it's a big part of our history, and the idea of exploring. I mean, that's huge. Even when I get to teach in the daytime with like the engineering design process, and exploring is huge in education.
Sure.
Having students do that. So like looking at those principles, but then also looking at, okay, what could have Christopher Columbus done right? What could have been his approach instead than what he did? And asking those questions. And I mean, I know they're hypothetical, but still it gives students an opportunity to reflect on someone else's maybe misbehavior per se. So I don't know.
Yeah.
What else do you want to add to this? Like, what do you think?
I mean, I think a lot of people you would talk to in our age range would tell you the same thing, that most of our childhood wasn't honest with us when we talk about like the history of the place that we grew up in, right? I grew up in Massachusetts. My first house was miles from the Battle of Lexington and Concord. We don't talk about the hard things because people assume students can't handle it, right? They can't handle the hard conversation. But I think, and granted, like I'm privileged, right? I'm a white man in America. I have a lot of privilege, but I also think about, what about that indigenous student in my class who for their entire life has heard Christopher Columbus discovered America, and the United States made the United States what it is today. And I think about how hard must it be to sit there if you truly know your own people's history,
Mm-hmm.
and listen to somebody idolize a Christopher Columbus type person.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it make more sense for everybody to hear, hey, Columbus did these things, but he also did these things? And then ask the question, how should Columbus be remembered?
Yeah.
Because you've now given that, and that we do a lot of the conversation on that, especially when we do our early presidents in my class, from Washington to Jackson. What is their legacy? And you have kids who say Jefferson was, one of the most important leaders. He had an instrumental impact on our government. And then other people say he was a hypocritical slave owner who raped women that he owned so that he could procreate and have more enslaved people. And then you get the kids who I think really showcase their critical thinking skills, and they say, I had a student say this last year, everybody wants to live in black and white, but there's a gray. He's both instrumental because he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He is also a hypocrite. So it's not always an and or. It can be a combination. And you can say their legacy as a human being is terrible. But what they did for the foundation of this country, with being the writer of the Declaration of Independence and being, a major part of the constitutional process, it led to these good things. It doesn't mean they're a great person, but it does. I talk to them a lot about this. It's not about negating them one way or the other. Yeah. It's about understanding the whole person in the way that we want our students to understand the full story.
Right.
So I'm doing a disservice if I just trash Jefferson or if I just praise Jefferson.
Right.
So my job is, here's everything we can do with Jefferson.
Yeah.
Because that's where the understanding happens. And to circle back to culturally responsive teaching, that's where relationship building happens.
Yeah, exactly.
The kids who feel heard and seen through stories of history are the ones who continually, year over year, will tell me, nobody's approached history in the way that you did, or I didn't think that history was going to be anything I could relate to.
Yeah.
But then when we did this one lesson, and that's the thing, I don't care if it's every lesson or one lesson, but if that kid remembers one lesson that I taught this year because they felt seen and felt heard, then I am doing my job as a culturally responsive teacher because I've made a connection with them.
Yeah.
And they know that in this space that stories that are like theirs will be talked about and not pushed to the side.
Now, that's really good. And even as you're telling me this, it's interesting that you're bringing this up. And when you said relationships, you just hit the nail on the head. Because for me, it gets really personal. And the reason why is because my mom's always told me this. She said, take the good traits you have from your father and myself and leave out the bad ones. Like the things that we do that are not right, or the things that you think or the things that we're doing that you don't agree with, don't do them. And the things that you do appreciate from us, take those traits. And I'm like, and it's the same thing like you're just saying, like, let's look at the whole picture. And I feel like that's exactly where we need to move on from society. And and even like, just when it comes to like looking at different leaderships, like for example, let's just take like the Enneagram, for example. I'm gonna just use this, like the Enneagram 8. That's where I find myself. Okay. And I recently learned that the Enneagram 8, Martin Luther King was one.
Okay.
But so was Donald Trump. So when I look at that, I'm like, okay, what qualities can I take from both of these individuals that I do want to learn? And also, what qualities do I not want to take from them?
Yeah.
So it kind of goes back to like, like let's just have that perspective. What is the good that we can learn from this lesson? And where do we not want history to repeat itself again?
Yeah. And it's taking, I think that's really interesting. It's that introspective point of the good and the bad, right? You have to look at the good qualities of yourself, even similar to your point about looking at two people who matched you on the Enneagram, right? We have to look at the bad and the good because those are the same qualities. Like when I think about my son, what are the things that I do that I want him to continue to do? And what are the things that I do that I don't want him to do at all?
Right.
And when we ask those questions historically, what we're actually doing, to your point, is teaching our kids, you have to understand the bad to make things better. And the longer we want to ignore the negatives of what's happened before us, the less we're going to have a chance at moving forward. Right? It's been proven in history. when they ignored the topic of slavery, it led to civil war.
Yeah.
Right? So the longer we ignore whatever it is that people are afraid to talk about, the longer it's going to take for us to get to where we want to be. So we have to have those hard conversations. We have to be culturally responsive teachers, because it's the only way that we create that growth.
Yeah, that's so true. That is so true, Pete. Well, hey, I want to thank you, man, for taking time to talk about this, and just to really you've enlightened me a lot, especially because of the grade levels that you get a chance to work with, and I just really appreciate you, man. So thank you again, dude.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure, and obviously, as you can tell, I could talk about this for hours.
Oh, we can, yeah. And you know what? I'll probably hit you up again later on if there's other issues or things that happen. Maybe we'll have a special election episode or something. I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, sounds good.
I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in today, and I hope you really enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future topics, please feel free to send an email to cbgarcia@sandiego.edu. Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Innovative Pedag. So it's Innovative PEDAG. All right, until next time, and we will talk to you all and see you all later. All right.